December 21, 1944, southern Belgium. In the frozen woodlands south of Malmedy, German troops huddled in defensive positions as dawn approached. When American artillery opened fire that morning, one veteran soldier instantly realized this was unlike anything he had experienced before. He had endured years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, watched entire formations vanish under Soviet fire, and survived relentless bombardments. Yet this barrage followed rules he did not recognize. The explosions were not striking the ground. Instead, shells were bursting high above the snow, detonating with uncanny accuracy several meters in the air. Shards of steel rained downward, turning trenches and foxholes normally a soldier's last refuge into deadly traps. Lying pressed against the frozen soil, Weber felt fragments hiss past his helmet as men around him were cut down by shrapnel arriving from every direction. Earlier that same morning, in the dim lights before sunrise, Weber had examined an unexploded American shell. What he saw inside its nose defied everything German engineers believed possible. Embedded within the fuse was a compact radio device roughly the size of a wine bottle, filled with tiny glass vacuum tubes. These fragile-looking components had survived being fired from a gun under forces that should have shattered them instantly. German weapons experts had spent years proving such a mechanism could not exist. The Americans had not only solved the problem, they were producing the devices in vast numbers. In that moment, it became clear that Germany was facing an industrial and scientific opponent unlike any it had known. The weapon terrifying German troops in Belgium did not originate on the battlefield. Its story began years earlier, inside American laboratories and factories, when scientists were asked to solve a challenge every major power had abandoned as unsolvable. On June 27, 1940, the United States created the National Defense Research Committee, placing it under the leadership of Vannevar Bush. The committee assembled many of the nation's top physicists and engineers, including Merle Tuve, a brilliant, intense researcher whose forceful personality would drive a rapidly expanding team of specialists. Their mission addressed a deadly problem. Axis aircraft were devastating Allied ships and ground forces. Conventional anti-aircraft artillery relied either on direct hits nearly impossible against fast-moving planes or on time delay fuses set to explode at estimated altitudes. The results were grim. Tens of thousands of shells were often required to destroy a single aircraft, with some estimates far higher. The idea of a proximity-triggered fuse was simple in concept. If a shell could sense when it was close to a target and detonate automatically, accuracy would improve dramatically. But with the technology of the 1930 seconds, this idea remained out of reach. Germany had experimented with proximity fuses as early as 1930, testing dozens of concepts. Some relied on sound, activating when they detected engine noise. Others attempted to sense electrical charges around aircraft. None proved reliable. By the outbreak of the war, German researchers had concluded the problem could not be solved with existing technology. In 1940, German leadership ordered research efforts to focus only on weapons that could be fielded within months. Proximity fuse programs were quietly dropped. Although limited work resumed in 1944, it came far too late to matter. Britain had made more progress. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment proposed using a miniature radar system based on the Doppler effect. Early versions were tested on rockets, which experienced far less stress than artillery shells. However, two obstacles halted the British effort. First, production costs were enormous, and Britain's industry was already overstretched. Second, the electronics could not be made rugged enough. Even the smallest available vacuum tubes designed for hearing aids were too delicate to survive gunfire. By 1941, British prototypes worked only about half the time under controlled conditions, an unacceptable rate for combat use. This research was shared with the United States through the TISAD mission, but it would be America that transformed theory into a practical weapon. American scientists took the British concepts and applied something no other nation could match: massive industrial scale combined with relentless engineering refinement. Their goal was not merely to build a functioning fuse, but to manufacture it reliably by the millions. At Johns Hopkins University, what would become the Applied Physics Laboratory was officially established on March 10, 1942, beginning operations in a rented garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. Tuve's team, known as Section T, settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar. A tiny transmitter in the shell's nose emitted radio waves in the 180 to 220 MHz range. When these waves reflected off an aircraft, their frequency shifted. Once the returning signal reached a specific threshold, the fuse triggered the explosive charge. While the concept was elegant, execution was brutal. Everything had to fit inside the narrow nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, alongside safety systems, a power supply, and a detonator, while leaving room for several kilograms of high explosive. The device had to survive long storage, operate in extreme cold or heat, and function flawlessly during a flight lasting only seconds. The greatest challenge was launch shock. When fired, a shell accelerated to over 2,600 feet per second in just a few meters, subjecting its components to forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity. It also spun at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. Any weakness would instantly destroy the electronics. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the laboratory in 1942, was tasked with solving this problem. Working with engineers at companies such as Sylvania, he redesigned miniature vacuum tubes from the ground up. Glass casings were thickened, internal structures reinforced, and fragile elements shortened and strengthened. The completed tubes were embedded in wax to absorb shock. Testing was relentless. Complete fuses were fired vertically into soft ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Virginia, allowing engineers to recover them and study failures under microscopes. After countless firings and redesigns, progress came slowly. By late 1941, about half of the fuses survived and functioned correctly. The U.S. Navy, desperate for improved air defense, accepted this imperfect success and authorized full-scale production. As manufacturing techniques improved, reliability surged. By early 1943, over 90% of the proximity fuses worked as intended, marking a quiet technological revolution that would reshape air defense and battlefield artillery for the remainder of the war. Vacuum tubes were only one of many obstacles engineers faced while developing the proximity fuse. Another major issue was power. Standard batteries at the time were bulky and unreliable, especially in hot, humid climates where their shelf life was short. To solve this, designers created a reserve battery that remained inactive until the moment of firing. Its liquid electrolyte was stored separately from the battery plates. When the shell left the gun barrel, the rapid spin forced the liquid into contact with the plates, instantly producing electricity. This clever design allowed the battery to be stored indefinitely without degradation. Safety posed an even greater challenge. The fuse had to remain inert while still inside the gun, and only arm itself once it had traveled a safe distance. It also needed protection from accidental triggering caused by radio signals or even the ship's own radar systems. Another problem emerged when shells were fired at shallow angles over the ocean. Reflections from the water could cause premature explosions. To counter this, engineers added wave suppression circuits. Each safeguard made the system more complex, but none could be omitted. By the time the design was finalized, a single proximity fuse contained roughly 130 tiny electronic parts. The Mark 32 fuse, developed for the Navy's 5-inch gun, measured about 8 inches in length and weighed just over 2 pounds. Hidden inside its steel body was what may have been the most advanced example of miniaturized electronics anywhere in the world in 1942. The first real-world trial took place on August 12, 1942 in Chesapeake Bay. The light cruiser USS Cleveland was tasked with testing the new shells against 3 radio-controlled target aircraft. Normally, destroying such agile targets with conventional ammunition required dozens of rounds. Using proximity-fused shells, Cleveland's gunners eliminated all 3 drones with only 4 bursts on the very first day. The results were so decisive that the Navy immediately ended further testing and ordered full-scale production. 5 major companies were chosen to manufacture the fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQueen Norris. Early output was modest, about 500 units per day by the end of 1942, but American industry was just beginning to mobilize. By late 1943, daily production had surged to 40,000 fuses. Over the course of the war, more than 22 million units were produced at a total cost exceeding $1 billion in 1940s currency. More than 100 factories contributed to different stages of production. Crosley's plant in Cincinnati alone turned out roughly 5.25 million fuses, accounting for nearly a quarter of total output. With a workforce of 10,000 operating around the clock, the factory reached peak production of 16,500 units per day. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts produced even more, about 5.68 million fuses, while also supplying 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used in the program. Much of the delicate assembly work was carried out by thousands of workers, many of them women, all operating under strict secrecy. Employees signed confidentiality agreements and were searched upon entering and leaving the facilities. Most had no idea what they were building. Security around the proximity fuse program was exceeded only by that of the Manhattan Project. To conceal its true function, the device was deliberately labeled the VT fuse, supposedly meaning variable time, rather than revealing its role as a radio-based proximity detector. Even its existence was classified, and early combat use was limited to scenarios where unexploded shells could not be recovered by the enemy. The fuse made its combat debut on January 5, 1943, near Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, during an attack by 4 Japanese Aichi dive bombers on a U.S. Midday bombers on a U.S. debut. Navy Task Force, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch guns aboard USS Helena, fired 3 salvos at the retreating aircraft. Each shell detonated close to one bomber, tearing it apart with fragments. The aircraft crashed into the sea, destroyed without a direct hit. News of the success spread quickly throughout the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, large shipments of proximity-fused ammunition were arriving at Pearl Harbor. Battlefield performance exceeded all expectations. That year, shells equipped with proximity fuses were credited with shooting down more than half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire, despite being used in only a quarter of the rounds fired. Admiral Arleigh Burke later recalled that during his service with fast carrier task forces, proximity fuses brought down enemy planes in astonishing numbers. Their ultimate value was demonstrated during a massive kamikaze attack off Okinawa on May 11, 1945. 2 destroyers, USS Hadley and USS Evans, were assaulted by roughly 150 Japanese aircraft during Operation Kikusui No. 6. Over 1 hour and 25 minutes of relentless fighting, the 2 ships and 4 support vessels faced overwhelming force. Hadley shot down 23 aircraft before being struck by multiple bombs, kamikazes, and a rocket bomb. Evans accounted for additional attackers before being hit 4 times and left powerless in the water. Despite catastrophic damage, both ships survived. In the aftermath, the effectiveness of proximity-fused ammunition was considered beyond dispute. It had been essential. Yet, for most of the war, U.S. commanders were forbidden from using the fuse over land. The danger of an unexploded shell falling into enemy hands was deemed too great. If German or Japanese scientists managed to replicate the technology, the consequences could be devastating. Intelligence estimates suggested that if Germany deployed proximity fuses in its air defenses, Allied bomber losses might increase by as much as 300%. For a time, Allied planners feared that the entire strategic bombing effort could be undermined. The reason was secrecy. Proximity fuses, an advanced and highly classified technology, were initially approved for use only over open water. If a shell malfunctioned and failed to detonate, it would sink harmlessly, preventing the enemy from recovering and studying it. This concern was not theoretical. During the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943, an unexploded proximity-fused shell landed intact on land. Alarmed by the risk, Allied headquarters immediately dispatched a special recovery team to retrieve it before German forces could reach the site. At that stage of the war, protecting the secret was considered absolutely critical. That policy began to unravel in the summer of 1944. In June, Germany introduced a new weapon against Britain, the Von flying bomb. Launched from sites across the English Channel, these pilotless missiles traveled at nearly 400 miles per hour, too fast for many Allied fighters to intercept. Small, swift, and arriving with little warning, the Von posed a terrifying challenge to British air defences. Between June and late August 1944, more than 9,000 Vons were launched toward Britain, killing and injuring tens of thousands of civilians. Early defensive efforts were largely ineffective. Only about 17% of the Vons entering the coastal defense zone were destroyed. The situation was rapidly becoming catastrophic. Faced with mounting losses, Prime Minister Winston Churchill approved the use of proximity fuses in Britain's anti-aircraft guns. New versions of the fuses were rushed into mass production, specifically adjusted to detonate near the fast-moving compact Von targets. British and American gun crews along the coast combined these shells with improved radar tracking and advanced fire control computers. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within a month, interception success rose to nearly 3/4 of incoming missiles. On one day in late August, more than 80% of the Vons were destroyed before reaching their targets. Churchill later acknowledged that proximity fuses were central to the newfound effectiveness of Britain's air defences. The Von campaign proved beyond any doubt that the proximity fuse was a decisive technological breakthrough, but it also meant that the secret was no longer fully protected. Thousands of shells were now detonating over land, and the danger of enemy recovery, once unthinkable, had become a calculated risk. That calculation shifted entirely in December 1944. On the morning of December 16, more than 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks surged forward in a massive surprise assault, Hitler's final gamble on the Western Front. The offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, drove through the dense Ardennes forest with the goal of splitting Allied forces and capturing the crucial port of Antwerp. The attack caught the Allies completely off guard. Within days, German units had carved a deep salient nearly 50 miles into Allied lines. Severe winter weather grounded Allied aircraft, and thick cloud cover made aerial observation nearly impossible. German commanders believed these conditions shielded them from effective artillery fire. They were mistaken. On the same day the offensive began, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the U.S. 406th Artillery Group faced a critical decision. German troops were pressing hard against the lightly equipped 38th Cavalry Squadron near Monschau. Immediate artillery support was essential. Axelson had recently received proximity-fused artillery shells known by the codename Posit. However, formal authorization to use them over land had not yet been granted by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. The rules still forbade it. But the battlefield could not wait. Axelson chose to act. He ordered the shells fired. The impact was devastating. For the first time in the European theater, American artillery achieved perfectly consistent airbursts regardless of terrain, visibility, or weather. Each shell detonated precisely 20 to 50 feet above the ground, optimized to inflict maximum damage on exposed infantry. Instead of burying fragments in the soil, the explosions scattered lethal shrapnel downward in wide, cone-shaped patterns. Foxholes offered no protection. Even reinforced bunkers were penetrated from above. Veteran German soldiers, many hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, had never encountered anything like it. The shells arrived silently at extreme velocity. The explosion overhead was the first and only warning. 3 days later, on December 19, Eisenhower formally requested unrestricted authorization for the use of proximity fuses. By then, the technology had already reshaped the battlefield and the outcome of the war. By late December 1944, restrictions on the use of proximity fuses were finally removed. What followed was an unprecedented escalation. Within roughly 6 weeks, Allied artillery units fired close to 200,000 proximity-fused shells across the European front. The effect on German forces was swift and overwhelming. General George S. Patton later described one such engagement in a letter to the U.S. War Department. Near the Sauer River, elements of his Third Army detected a German battalion attempting a river crossing. Artillery units responded with a concentrated barrage using the new fuzes. When the firing stopped, American forces counted 702 enemy dead. Patton remarked that the shell with the strange fuse was extraordinarily destructive, and he predicted it would force armies worldwide to rethink how wars were fought. With clear satisfaction, he noted that the United States had achieved this breakthrough first. The weapon's impact was felt even earlier on the morning of December 20 during the defense of Malmedy. Around 4:30 a.m., German forces from SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's Brigade 150, part of a broader deception operation, launched an assault on the town. American artillery units supporting the defenders employed proximity-fused shells with devastating results. Explosions burst in mid-air above the attackers, spreading fragmentation downward. The psychological shock was so intense that some German troops ran directly toward American lines, seeking refuge from the explosions overhead. By the afternoon, the attack had collapsed. Interrogations of German prisoners later revealed how deeply unsettling this new technology was. One captured German artillery officer, questioned in January 1900, he argued that American engineers could solve problems deemed impossible elsewhere by applying vast resources without regard to cost. The fuse, he said, required not only advanced design but an enormous manufacturing base. Germany, he concluded, lacked the industrial depth to build such a weapon, regardless of the skill of its engineers. Another prisoner, a Luftwaffe engineer, focused on the air war. He believed that if Germany had possessed proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, the Allied bombing campaign might have been forced to stop. Sustained aircraft losses of 15 to 20% per mission would have made continued operations impossible. Yet, he acknowledged the same limitation. Germany simply could not afford the economic and industrial commitment such a system demanded. Producing proximity fuses required hundreds of factories and investment on a scale only the American economy could sustain. For German soldiers under fire, the experience was even more immediate. They were being killed by a weapon they did not understand, produced in quantities they could never equal. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery doctrine evolved to fully exploit the fuse's capabilities. Observers directed fire not only at confirmed targets but across suspected enemy positions. Entire zones were saturated with shellfire, and nearly every round detonated in the air at lethal height. Defensive tactics that had worked for years suddenly failed. Trenches, foxholes, and forest cover became death traps. Movement under artillery fire was often fatal. German units attempted to respond by spreading out and remaining mobile, but these measures offered limited protection. The proximity fuse had changed the battlefield itself. American intelligence began documenting what they termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition marked by paralysis, panic, and refusal to advance under proximity-fused bombardment. Some German units suffered breakdowns in discipline, with soldiers openly resisting orders to move through areas covered by American artillery. German commanders even offered rewards for intact fuses, hoping captured examples might reveal weaknesses or lead to countermeasures. Anticipating such efforts, American scientists at Wright Field in Ohio developed electronic jamming systems by early 1945, assuming the Germans would attempt to interfere with the fuse's radio signals. In reality, German engineers never fully understood what they had recovered. Convinced that radio equipment could not survive the extreme acceleration of artillery firing, they failed to realize that each shell contained a miniature transmitter. As Allied armies pushed toward the Rhine and deeper into Germany between January and March 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots reported shells that seemed to detonate automatically as aircraft approached, regardless of altitude or evasive maneuvers. What had once been dangerous but manageable air defenses became nearly insurmountable. On the ground, the effect was equally decisive. During Rhine crossing operations, American artillery unleashed tens of thousands of proximity-fused rounds, creating destruction so dense that organized German resistance often collapsed. In cities, the shells were especially lethal. Detonations set to explode above rooftops rained fragments into streets and buildings, making urban defenses untenable. Reflecting after the war, General Dwight D. Eisenhower assessed the proximity fuse in blunt terms. He suggested that if Germany had succeeded in fielding such a weapon even 6 months earlier than the Allies, the invasion of Western Europe might have faced obstacles so severe that success would have been doubtful. The scenario historians later reconstructed was unsettling. Had German air defense units possessed fully operational proximity fuses, the Allied landings in Normandy might not have been viable at all. Artillery shells detonating at optimal distances above advancing troops could have caused losses severe enough to stall or even reverse the invasion. Post-war analysis of seized German research files revealed just how close this possibility had come. German engineers had explored more than 30 different proximity trigger concepts, many of them technically impressive. One design, known as the Kraunig acoustic fuse, relied on a mechanical sound filter linked to a resonant switching mechanism. Rheinmetall Borsig experimented with electrostatic fuses that detected changes in capacitance. Other teams pursued optical, magnetic, and even radio-based designs that echoed the general idea behind the American solution. Yet none of these projects moved beyond limited trials. When work resumed in earnest in 1944 at facilities such as Rheinmetall, hundreds of functioning prototypes were built and test-fired. By then, however, the strategic window had already closed. Germany no longer had the industrial strength to transition from prototypes to mass production. Any attempt to do so would have drained resources desperately needed for tanks, aircraft, and standard ammunition. The contrast with the American effort could not have been sharper. The US proximity fuse program operated on a scale that eclipsed the entire German military research apparatus. Adjusted for the era, it consumed more than $1 billion. That figure covered not only scientific development but also the construction of specialized factories, the training of tens of thousands of workers, and an extraordinary security regime that concealed the project's very existence. Production numbers alone tell the story. At its height, American industry was turning out roughly 70,000 proximity fuses every single day. Achieving that output required the manufacture and assembly of billions of precision components, each tested and shipped to combat zones across the globe. As output grew, costs fell dramatically. In 1942, a single fuse cost over $700. By the end of the war, streamlined manufacturing had reduced that figure to just $18, a reduction of more than 97%. Even at that price, the fuse was not cheap, but its battlefield value made the expense easy to justify. A shell equipped with a proximity fuse could achieve the same effect as 5 to 10 conventional rounds. Since the shell itself cost no more than before, investing in a fuse that multiplied effectiveness was an obvious calculation. Secrecy remained absolute throughout the war. Workers in one factory were unaware that identical components were being produced elsewhere. Suppliers fabricated parts without knowing their function. The program's classification was lifted only after hostilities ended in September 1945. For German prisoners of war held in Britain, the truth became impossible to ignore as they watched anti-aircraft guns destroy V-1 flying bombs in mid-air. The same technology that had shattered German formations in the Ardennes was now shielding British cities. Many later described an experience similar to that of prisoners held in the United States who witnessed the sheer scale of American industrial output, a dawning realization that they had faced an opponent whose resources were beyond comparison. Interviews conducted after repatriation in 1946 captured this shift in perspective. One former Wehrmacht officer recalled that the proximity fuse was the moment he truly understood Germany had lost the war not because of the device itself, but because of what it symbolized. It solved a problem German planners had deemed essentially impossible. Doing so required scientific depth, manufacturing discipline, and economic capacity Germany simply did not possess. If the United States could build miniature radio systems small enough to fit inside artillery shells and make them survive the extreme forces of firing, what other boundaries might they overcome? To that officer, the answer was clear. Germany had been fighting a modern war with outdated assumptions about technological limits. The proximity fuse embodied multiple breakthroughs at once. It depended on advances in miniaturized vacuum tubes, demanding new glass formulas and precision heat treatment methods. Its circuitry relied on some of the earliest large-scale printed circuit boards. The reserve battery, activated only by the shell's spin in flight, was a novel solution. The radio design itself was both compact and remarkably robust. Yet the greatest achievement lay not in any single invention, but in production. Manufacturing millions of complex electronic devices with consistent reliability required quality control systems and industrial processes that barely existed before the war. In that sense, the proximity fuse was not just a weapon, it was proof that industrialized science had become a decisive force on the battlefield. American wartime manufacturing became a turning point not only for the conflict itself, but for the future of modern industry. During World War II, U.S. factories introduced advanced systems for statistical quality control, automated inspection, and coordinated supply chains methods that later became standard across global manufacturing. Just as important was the human side of production. Massive training programs transformed tens of thousands of ordinary civilians, many without technical education, into skilled workers capable of assembling delicate electronic components while working under microscopes. The scientific impact of this effort extended far beyond the battlefield. Physicist James Van Allen, who contributed to the development of durable vacuum tubes for proximity fuses, later applied the same principles of miniaturization and resilience to instruments designed for space research. When the Explorer 1 satellite was launched in 1958, the equipment that led to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts was directly influenced by technology first created to survive the violent forces of artillery fire. Lessons learned from protecting electronics during shell acceleration proved invaluable when designing devices that had to endure the stresses of rocket launches. This transfer of knowledge did not stop with space exploration. Engineers who gained experience working on proximity fuses carried their expertise into the post-war electronics industry. They brought with them refined skills in compact design, rigorous quality assurance, and large-scale production capabilities that shaped the emerging technological economy. Militarily, the influence of the proximity fuse continued well after World War II. Improved versions were deployed during the Korean War, and the underlying concept remains embedded in modern weaponry. Missile systems such as the Phoenix, the Standard Missile Series, and the Patriot air defense system all rely on proximity detonation principles first realized in the early 1940s. While today's fuses use solid-state electronics, microprocessors, and advanced signal analysis to distinguish real targets from decoys and function under electronic interference, the basic logic remains the same. Detect a target through reflected radio signals, calculate the optimal point of explosion, and detonate for maximum effect. Yet, the American war effort revealed more than technological superiority. German soldiers captured during the conflict encountered something that challenged their expectations even more deeply than advanced weaponry. Despite years of propaganda portraying Americans as soft or overly sentimental, prisoners of war discovered an enemy that combined firmness with an unexpected degree of humanity. Medical care left a particularly strong impression. German physicians worked side by side with American medical staff, gaining exposure to modern equipment and techniques rarely available even to elites back home. Prisoners underwent surgeries that would have been inaccessible to most civilians in Germany. Psychological care, virtually non-existent in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Suicide attempts were met with counseling rather than punishment, and those suffering mental collapse received treatment instead of abuse. This approach reflected a quiet confidence and authority rooted not in cruelty but in strength. By early 1945, the American camp system expanded its focus beyond confinement. Thousands of German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs studying English, U.S. history, and democratic theory. Correspondence courses were organized through institutions such as the University of Chicago. Men who had arrived as committed supporters of the Nazi regime were now writing essays about rebuilding Germany along democratic lines. Officers once bound by personal oaths to Hitler were discussing how American agricultural and industrial practices could be adapted after the war. The transformation became so pronounced that U.S. officials worried some prisoners were growing overly enthusiastic about American life. A number even asked to remain in the United States once the war ended. Between 1945 and 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners were sent back to a homeland that was shattered, divided, and impoverished. Many returned carrying more than memories. They brought first-hand knowledge of how a democratic, industrial society functioned. In the years that followed, former prisoners played meaningful roles in West Germany's reconstruction, introducing American industrial methods and political ideas into the rebuilding process. Taken together, the story of the proximity fuse reflects the broader character of American wartime production. The United States surpassed the Axis powers not only in volume, but in reliability and technological depth. American weapons were not always superior in isolation, but they worked consistently, could be produced in vast numbers, and incorporated innovations that reshaped combat. This blend of scale and sophistication proved decisive. The proximity fuse acted as a force multiplier, turning numerical advantage into overwhelming battlefield dominance. By the war's final phase, German forces faced opponents with superior firepower, advanced technology, and production capacity that rendered traditional tactics ineffective. The consequences were visible in casualty figures. During the Battle of the Bulge, despite initial German advantages in surprise and terrain, losses were heavily lopsided. American artillery accounted for an unusually large share of German casualties. Medical reports noted that proximity-fused shells caused more devastating injuries than conventional artillery. Explosions above ground sent fragments downward, striking the head and upper body. Multiple shrapnel wounds were common, and overall lethality was markedly higher. By March 1945, as Allied armies prepared to cross the Rhine and push into the heart of Germany, proximity-fused ammunition had become standard across U.S. artillery units. American factories were producing fuses faster than logistics could deliver them to Europe. Germany never succeeded in developing an effective countermeasure. The outcome was clear: industrial capacity, technological innovation, and organizational discipline combined with an unexpected commitment to human values had reshaped both the war and the world that followed. Electronic countermeasures against the new artillery fuses were theoretically imaginable, but in practice they were out of reach. Effective jamming required precise knowledge of the fuse's operating frequency and internal behavior. German engineers never captured functioning examples in usable condition, leaving them unable to determine the parameters needed to interfere with the signal. Even with that knowledge, deploying electronic jammers across every possible target area would have been logistically unfeasible. Attempts at physical defenses offered no better solution. The fuses relied on reflected radio waves to detonate above the ground. There was no realistic way to reduce the radar signature of soldiers or equipment. Even the human body reflected enough energy to activate the fuse at close distance. The only viable response was dispersion, spreading troops far enough apart that a single shell could not strike multiple targets. Yet this came at a heavy cost. German combat doctrine depended on tightly organized formations. Dispersal weakened firepower, disrupted coordination, and reduced overall effectiveness even as it slightly lowered casualties. By the final phase of the war, the psychological impact of American artillery had become overwhelming. Many German units avoided movement during daylight hours. Positions that appeared exposed or easily targeted were abandoned. Fear replaced initiative, and morale steadily collapsed. Allied intelligence reports recorded a growing pattern among prisoners. Artillery was cited as the primary reason for surrender. It was not death itself that terrified them. Soldiers had long accepted that risk, but the nature of proximity-fused shells, which allowed no warning, no cover, and no meaningful way to resist. This was psychological warfare achieved without leaflets or broadcasts, driven purely by repeated demonstrations of hopelessness. After the war, historians concluded that the proximity fuse was among the most consequential technological advantages of the conflict. Its contribution shortened campaigns and saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. In the Pacific, it dramatically improved air defense, especially against kamikaze attacks, preventing ship losses that would have slowed or altered major operations. Its strategic value was magnified by scale. By late 1944, proximity fuses were produced in such numbers that they could be used freely. Fire missions once considered too costly became standard practice. Large areas could be blanketed with overlapping defensive patterns. Suspected enemy positions no longer required confirmation before engagement. The knowledge that this firepower was effectively limitless had an effect on morale equal to its physical destructiveness. The influence of the proximity fuse extended far beyond the battlefield. The program accelerated advances in miniaturization, quality control, and mass production of complex electronics. Training systems developed for fuse assembly proved that highly technical work could be performed reliably by workers without advanced education, given proper instruction and oversight. These methods shaped post-war American industry. The same principles fed directly into the space program, early computing, and the emergence of transistor-based electronics. Many of the scientists involved went on to define entire fields. James Van Allen became a pioneer of space science. Merle Tuve continued to lead major research institutions. Others dispersed into universities, industrial laboratories, and government agencies, carrying with them hard-earned expertise in systems engineering and electronic design. The manufacturing infrastructure built for fuse production did not disappear after the war. Factories that once produced vacuum tubes transitioned to televisions and consumer electronics. Precision assembly workers became the backbone of a rapidly growing industry. Supply chains established under wartime pressure supported peacetime technological expansion. Ultimately, the proximity fuse reflects a broader contrast in wartime strategy. Germany invested in revolutionary weapons, jets, rockets, and other advanced systems that arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The United States focused on technologies that could be produced immediately, reliably, and at immense scale. The proximity fuse was not a mythical superweapon. It was a highly effective tool designed from the outset for mass manufacture. Every development decision prioritized reliability and production efficiency. The result was a weapon available in overwhelming quantities precisely when it mattered. This difference in approach proved decisive. Rather than seeking singular breakthroughs to reverse the tide, American strategy aimed to amplify numerical and industrial advantages until resistance became futile. In this sense, the proximity fuse came to symbolize American industrial power during World War II. It fused advanced science with practical engineering, demanded enormous investment, and delivered proportional results. It was sophisticated yet robust, innovative yet dependable, and affordable at scale. It demonstrated how seemingly impossible challenges could be solved through resources, organization, and persistence. German veterans later described facing proximity-fused artillery not merely as confronting a clever weapon, but as encountering undeniable evidence of superior science, industry, and national capacity. No single battle ended their resistance. Instead, countless engagements reinforced the same conclusion. They were fighting an opponent whose capabilities could not be matched or countered. That realization eroded the will to fight and hastened the collapse of the Third Reich. The proximity fuse transformed warfare not through spectacle, but through accumulation. What experts once declared impossible miniaturized electronics surviving artillery launch, produced by the tens of millions, became reality. It stands as proof that victory often comes not from chasing the extraordinary, but from making the essential achievable through sustained effort, intelligent design, and unmatched industrial strength.